In this video, we're going to have a look at evaluation and conclusions. And this is a really important video because evaluation is the assessment objective that students typically struggle the most with and get the lowest marks on in the final exam. We're going to start by looking at what evaluation is, where in your essay you should evaluate, and some key principles to use in your evaluation. We're then going to look in detail at how you should bring in evaluation in your introduction, in your mini conclusions, and in your overall conclusion, with lots of examples throughout. So starting off by looking at what is evaluation, AO3. So AO1, knowledge, and AO2 analysis we looked at in the previous video, and they're ultimately judged by the points you put forward on either side of the debate, that's your analysis, and the knowledge and examples you're able to bring in to use and form them. AO3 evaluation, however, is about your overall judgment. So after introducing these key arguments on either side and using really good knowledge and examples to do so, you need to really clearly make a judgment about which side of the argument you find most persuasive. You need to be able to explain and justify this conclusion really well. So where in your essay should you evaluate? So conclusion is the most obvious place where you should evaluate and settle your judgment in your essay. However, it shouldn't just be in your conclusion. So evaluation makes up a third of your overall marks, and it should be in every single paragraph. So you should introduce and briefly justify your argument at the end of your introduction, as we looked at when we looked at the instructions video. At the end of every main paragraph, you should have a mini conclusion that sets out which argument you found the most persuasive in this paragraph and links to your overall judgment. And then, of course, you should finish your essay with an overall conclusion that clearly states your overall judgment to the examiner and explains the key reasons you have come to that judgment. And there's three key principles I really want you to keep in mind when thinking about evaluation in your essays. The first is to decide what you actually think. Don't just pick a side randomly. So when deciding what to argue in an essay, you shouldn't just randomly decide, okay, I'm going to argue for here or I'm going to argue against, based on whichever seems easiest. Instead, you need to properly weigh up both sides of the argument in your head and decide which is the most persuasive. As this will make sure you're confident in what your judgment is and you're able to convincingly explain and just justify it. Because if you just pick it randomly, you're not going to be able to explain it because you haven't done the thinking in your head. So you need to really think, which side of the argument do I agree with, and then go with that one in your essay. Secondly, you need to be clear and consistent in your argument throughout your essay. So your conclusion really shouldn't come as a surprise to the examiner. Instead, your judgment should be really clear from your introduction and then consistent throughout your mini conclusions and your overall conclusion. As the essay planning video set out, this means that you should have a clear idea of what your overall judgment is before starting to write your essay. And thirdly, don't just state your judgment, explain your reasoning behind it. Stating a clear answer to the question is of course necessary and a great start, but to get more than a few marks for evaluation and really push up to those top grades, you need to really justify this answer to the question and explain how you've come to that judgment. And it's in this explanation of the reasoning that you'll pick up the vast majority of your AO3 marks, as anyone can effectively just say, I'm going to argue this way. It's about justifying it and explaining it as the real judgment. Okay, let's have a look now at the evaluation in different parts of the essay. We're going to start in the introduction, which we've already had a little bit of a look at in the instructions video, then mini conclusions, and then the overall conclusion. So the most important part of the introduction, as we went through in the instructions video, is clearly answering the question and succinctly justifying why you've come to that overall judgment. And a good way to do this, to add this justification, is potentially to add the most important reason why you've come to that judgment. So, just a quick example here. Evaluate the view that the UK no longer has a two-party system. So at the end of this introduction, as we've got in green here, we've got the evaluation here. So we're clearly setting an answer to the question. Overall, this essay will argue that the UK no longer has a two-party system. Pretty clear, simple language. There's no mistake from the examiner about what we're arguing. Over the past decade especially, minor parties have had a major influence on policy in the UK by pressuring the two main parties to adopt policy positions such as Brexit and net zero. So that's the key reason we've come to that judgment. And we're also saying that this influence is only going to increase. So it's the extent to which there's not a two-party system is only going to increase, as seen in the 2024 election. And looking at this next example for evaluate the view that Parliament is representative of the electorate, we started with clearly stating a really clear answer to the question. Overall, Parliament is representative of the electorate only to a limited extent. The House of Commons is elected, and MPs do seek to represent the interests of their constituents. However, this is outweighed by the fact that the House of Lords is fundamentally undemocratic. MPs usually vote according to the party whip, and that both houses of Parliament underrepresent women, ethnic minorities, and those who didn't go to university. So not only do we have a really clear answer to the question, we've really explained and justified our judgments. We've and this is kind of something we're going to go through when we look at the tips to go from an A to an A star. We've introduced maybe some of the key arguments from the other side, but then explained why our side of the argument is even more persuasive than that, and it's still really clear. It's not like we're sitting on the fence in any way. We're introducing some points from the other side that are important, but explaining why our side is even more persuasive than them. And this final example here, evaluate the view that direct democracy is superior to representative democracy. Again, a really clear argument. Overall, this essay will argue that direct democracy is superior as it is the purest form of democracy, directly involves the people in decision making, ensuring that the interests of the majority of the population are represented. So there, not only have we introduced the kind of a clear answer to the question, we've really justified it with the most important reason why and justification for it. And then we've added this is something you don't need to add, but something little at the end. The great use of referendums on key political issues in the UK. There should be greater use of referendums on key political issues in the UK in order to supplement and improve representative democracy. So we're also looking at what that should mean for politics in the UK today. As I said, you don't have to include that. It's a little thing that will impress the examiner. Okay, so that's introductions. At the end of the introduction, you should have a clear answer to the question and kind of succinctly justify it with the most important reasons why. The actually majority of where your evaluation is going to come in your essay is in the mini conclusions. So in your main paragraphs, as we looked at in the previous main paragraph video, looking at AO1 and AO2, so after you've set out and analysed both sides of the debate in your main paragraphs, you should have a mini conclusion at the end of every main paragraph. And the purpose of this mini conclusion is to explain which side of the debate in the paragraph you find the most persuasive and really justify why. So very similar principles to what we did in the introduction, just for the particular topic of that main paragraph, and it should be consistent with your overall argument in the introduction and conclusion. As with the evaluation and introduction, as I said, start with a clear statement and then really justify why. So to give you an example here, I'll go through slowly so you can pause and read through the whole paragraph if you want to. But if we look at this mini conclusion there, so we set out one argument for this question. So it's evaluate the view that the UK no longer has a two-party system. We set out one argument that the UK does, there is still a two-party system because the Tory party and Labour dominate vote share and they're broad churches and have a lot of voters. Then the counter argument is that actually it's no longer a two-party system, especially due to the 2024 election, where their vote share significantly decreased, and parties like Reform and Green and the Green Party were able to pick up a lot of votes due to kind of offering different policy positions that voters supported. And here, if you look at our mini conclusion, very similar kind of principles to the introduction. We're starting by saying, which one do we agree with? Overall, the more persuasive argument is the UK is no longer a two-party system, and this will be consistent with our argument in the introduction and conclusion as well. Prior to the 2024 election, the UK was a two-party system, with the major parties dominating the vote share in 2017 and 2019. This is clearly no longer the case, however. Minor parties picked up over 40% of the electorate in the 2024 election, showing that Labour and the Tories are no longer broad churches and no longer dominate in terms of vote share, which were two central factors in defining the previous two-party system. So really explaining in a little bit of detail, really justifying why we've come to that overall conclusion. And if you're just picking one side randomly, as I stated near the start of this video, you're not going to be able to explain it in as much detail as that and really justify it. So we've introduced it and really justified why. The second paragraph here, again, I'll go slowly, so you can look at either side, evaluate the view that rights are well protected in the UK, and this one looks particularly at civil liberties pressure groups, so you've got the arguments that they are well protected because civil liberties pressure groups can hold the government to account through, so outsider groups can protect rights through legal challenges, but also putting pressure on the government, whilst insider pressure groups can influence legislation that protects rights. The other side is that a lot of rights-based pressure groups, civil liberties pressure groups, aren't effective at protecting rights because they're not a popular cause, whilst they're also limited by the government passing legislation to kind of really stop their influence. So that's the kind of both arguments on the other side. And if we look at the mini conclusion then, again, starting off with a pretty clear answer. Overall, whilst it's true that civil liberties pressure groups aren't always effective in the protection of rights, especially when there's a government intent on eroding rights, On the whole, they mostly ensure that rights are well protected in the UK, as they can both influence the passage of legislation that protects rights and limit the actions of the government that threatens rights, especially through legal challenges. So this displays something we're going to go through in the A to A star video. So the key tips to get an A star, it's kind of recognizing a point from the other side. So yes, it's true that they're not always effective, but still then arguing why why our argument is the most persuasive. So they're not always effective, but overall, they do mostly ensure that rights are well protected, and then justifying why, as they can influence legislation and limit the action of governments that threaten rights, especially through legal challenges. So really a quite clear answer to the question, but that doesn't mean it can't be nuanced and well explained. And then finally, we look to the conclusion. Again, it's not going to be a surprise by any means, or it shouldn't by any means be a surprise to the examiner what your overall conclusion is going to be once they get there, because it should be really consistent from the introduction and through your main paragraphs. So the purpose of the conclusion is to, one, bring together and synthesize the argument you set out in the main paragraphs of the essay, and secondly, clearly and finally state to the examiner your answer to the question and how it's backed up with evidence, logical and persuasive. So you start by directly answering the question using the terms of the question, as you can see here in this example. In conclusion, so it's about Prime Minister's questions or whether it should be abolished. In conclusion, PMQs is without doubt deeply flawed and doesn't provide the same level of effective scrutiny as select committees. However, there are a number of measures that could be used to prevent the negative image it presents to the public, and its function as a method of scrutiny should be improved and not abolished. So we're directly answering the question, saying it should be improved, not abolished. Though we've kind of done some recognition of the other side, and we're now going to then, so we've recognised the other side, we say actually it should be improved and not abolished, and we're going to explain that in our second point, which is synthesising and explaining the most important reasons you've come to this overall conclusion. And that's this purple bit here. The main role of PMQs is not to scrutinise the executive, but rather in providing an opportunity for genuine televised policy debate and ensuring the competence of the Prime Minister. PMQs is healthy for democracy, as it clearly shows the public their options come an election and ensures that the PM is aware they are superior to the rest of the legislature. So that shows that we've kind of really thought about why do we believe that they shouldn't be abolished, and we're not really arguing that PMQs is really good here. That's where you can bring in some nuance. You don't need to argue that the Prime Minister's questions is perfect in order for it to not be abolished. But we're saying that it does really have some value for democracy, and we've really explained that in detail why we think it should be reformed rather than abolished. So we're saying other methods of parliamentary scrutiny should certainly be improved, but PMQs is important for a variety of other reasons that should be improved, not abolished. So again, finishing off by clearly stating to the examiner, so it's clear that you're directly answering the question, even if you've brought in a bit of nuance. So yeah, as I've mentioned a couple of times, there are also some kind of tips on reaching the top marks, which is shown in some of these examples we're going to go through in particular in the A2A star video. So adding nuance to your judgments can really help you to get an A star. But before looking at these kind of tips on pushing for an A to A star, you should be really confident in the principles of this video and really confident in getting an A. And that should be clearly having a really clear answer to the question in the introduction, mini conclusions and conclusion, and that should be consistent, and really justifying why with the most important reasons why.